Just east of St. Louis, hidden behind a highway and a scatter of houses, stands a pyramid more than 1,000 years old. Broader at its base than the Great Pyramid of Giza, 10 stories of earth, shaped by human hands, one loaded basket of soil at a time, and almost nobody who drives past it every morning has any idea it is there. In the summer of 1811, a young lawyer named Henry Brackenridge stood at the foot of that same hill and could hardly believe it was real. He climbed to the top, looked out over a whole silent field of mounds, and then he asked the question that would poison American history for the next 100 years. Who built this? And without quite saying it out loud, he had already decided the answer could not be the native people living right there in the valley. The very people the United States was pushing off their land in those exact years. That assumption was a lie, one of the most damaging lies this continent has ever told about itself. And tonight, we are going to walk straight into it. This is a video about the lost cities of ancient North America. Real ones, the kind you can drive to. A city that once held more people than London. Earthworks older than the pyramids of Egypt, raised by people who had not yet planted a single crop. An observatory built out of soil that tracks a motion of the moon so slow that most people never lived to see it happen twice. Giant figures carved across the desert that you cannot even recognize as figures until you are looking straight down from the sky. But the story does not go where the internet will try to take you. There is a whole corner of the web that sells a mystery about these places, whispering about a vanished race of giants, a lost white civilization, a secret the museums are hiding. It is false, all of it, and the real story is stranger than the fairy tale and far more human. Because the people who built these wonders never disappeared. Their descendants are alive right now, tonight, in Oklahoma and New Mexico and Arizona and along the Mississippi. The mystery was never who they were. It is why a whole nation worked so hard for so long to pretend they were somebody else. We're going to count our way through the greatest of these places, a city that rivaled the capitals of medieval Europe. Mounds raised before the first stone was laid at Giza, a desert dynasty whose power ran through its women, canals that watered a civilization for 1,000 years until the people who dug them walked away for reasons no one has ever pinned down. And at every stop, we will run into that same lie, told over and over until at last we meet the quiet government scientist who spent 20 years and 700 pages burying it for good. So settle in, let the room go dark. We begin at the foot of the largest earthwork anyone ever raised north of Mexico, in the ruins of a city that America forgot it ever had. Its name is Monks Mound. Let us put a city back around it. 1. Cahokia, the city that rivaled London. Around the year 1050, on the wide Mississippi floodplain that archaeologists now call the American Bottom, something happened that nobody has fully explained to this day. For centuries the area had held modest farming villages, a scattering of people, nothing that would stop a traveller in his tracks. Then, in the space of a single generation, roughly a human lifetime, it exploded. A settlement of maybe 1,000 people became a planned city of somewhere between 15 and 20,000. Set that number against the old world at the very same moment. Around the year 1100, the city of London, capital of England, held a population in the same range. So did Paris. For a stretch of the Middle Ages, the largest city in what would one day become the United States was not a European colony. It had not been built by anyone from across the ocean. It sat on the banks of the Mississippi, and we call it Cahokia, and it was a real city, in every sense you would use that word. Thousands of pole and thatch houses laid out in neighbourhoods along courtyards and pathways. A grand central plaza, flat and swept and enormous, larger than dozens of football fields, deliberately engineered and levelled by hand. There were suburbs, a defensive wall ringed it, a wooden palisade of tens of thousands of logs, rebuilt several times, and at the heart of downtown stood that single colossal earthwork, Monks Mound, which was no burial mound. It was a raised platform, a kind of artificial acropolis, with an important building on its summit where you can imagine a ruler or a priest standing to look out over everything he governed. To raise that one structure, and the roughly 120 other mounds around it, the people of Cahokia moved an estimated 55 million cubic feet of earth. They had no wheels, no horses, no oxen, no draft animals of any kind. They moved it in woven baskets, on their backs, one load at a time, over decades. which is not really construction anymore. That is closer to devotion. They were astronomers too. West of the Great Mound, archaeologists found the post holes of a series of huge circles made from upright red cedar posts, structures researchers nicknamed Woodhenge. Line yourself up correctly at one of these circles at dawn on the spring or fall equinox, and the sun rises in a precise intended spot on the horizon, appearing to emerge right out of the shoulder of Monks Mound itself. That alignment is far too exact to be an accident, and from it we can read the purpose. This was, in effect, a calendar, a machine for tracking the turning of the year, and from the way farming societies everywhere have used such markers, we can reasonably assume it told the people when to plant and harvest, and when to gather for the great ceremonies that bound the city together. Whoever set those posts understood the sky with a precision that only patient observation across many years could earn. But the single most haunting thing ever found at Cahokia is not a building, it is a grave. In 1967, an archaeologist named Melvin Fowler began excavating a fairly ordinary-looking ridgetop mound at the edge of the city, catalogued with the unglamorous name Mound 72. What he found inside changed how we understand the entire civilization. The mound held the remains of around 270 people, and at its heart lay one of the most striking burials in all of North American archaeology, what researchers came to call the beaded burial. A prominent individual had been laid to rest on a bed, a kind of cape or blanket made of more than 20,000 polished shell beads, and those beads had been arranged into the shape of a great bird, wings spread, in the outline of a falcon. This is the Birdman, a falcon warrior figure who sat at the very centre of the religion of these people, a being who moved between the world of the living and the world of the sky. And given how much labour and how much treasure went into that single grave, to be laid to rest inside the wings of the Birdman was, as far as we can tell, to be honoured as something close to a god. Around that central figure lay treasures gathered from 1,000 miles in every direction. In one nearby cache, archaeologists found the graves of several high-status women, accompanied by well over 1,000 shell beads, sheets of shimmering mica, wooden staffs covered in sheets of hammered copper, gaming stones, and hundreds of finely worked arrowheads. And when they traced where those arrowheads came from, the raw stone told a story of astonishing reach. Some came from Tennessee, others from southern Illinois, from Wisconsin, from as far away as Oklahoma. This was a city sitting at the centre of a trade and pilgrimage network that spanned half a continent, pulling in goods and people and prestige from cultures hundreds of miles apart, long before a single European had any idea the place existed. The next part deserves honesty rather than theatrics. That same mound, Mound 72, also held mass graves. Dozens of people, most of them young, many of them women, buried together in ways that show they died at the same time, apparently sacrificed in connection with the deaths and ceremonies of the city's elite. This was a practice we know echoed forward in time among later peoples of the Mississippi, groups like the Natchez, whose customs European observers actually recorded. It is not a comfortable fact, but it is not a lurid one either. When scientists studied the chemistry of the bones, the isotopes laid down by the food and water these people had consumed in life, they learned something important. The sacrificed were not foreign captives dragged in from enemy territory. They were Cahokians, local people, which tells us this was not the cruelty of one tribe against another. It was the internal machinery of a complex state religion, with all the beauty and all the darkness that complex state religions have carried in every corner of the world, in Egypt, in Mesopotamia, in Mesoamerica, and here on the Mississippi. And there is one more revelation from that mound, a quieter one, that overturned an old assumption in a single stroke. For decades, scholars had looked at the beaded burial and assumed the honoured dead were all men, a nobility of warrior kings. Then, in 2016, a team went back and re-examined the skeletons themselves with modern methods. The central beaded figures included women, men and women, buried together at the very summit of Cahokian power. Whatever ran this city, it was not a brotherhood of male chiefs alone. Power here passed through both hands. And that small correction, women where we assumed only men, is a preview of something we're going to see again and again tonight. In the desert of New Mexico especially. The people who built ancient North America keep turning out to be more sophisticated and more surprising than the textbooks of a century ago were willing to imagine. So that is Cahokia at its height, a city to rival London, an earthen pyramid broader at its base than Giza, a calendar of cedar posts, a continental trade web, a state religion with priests and a warrior god and a hereditary elite. And then, within about 300 years of its explosive birth, it was gone. That is the mystery. This was no slow fade over 1,000 years. It was a genuine and relatively rapid collapse. The population began to thin in the 1200s. By around 1350, the greatest city north of Mexico had been completely, silently, abandoned, emptied. The plazas grown over, the great mound standing alone above the grass, exactly as Henry Brackenridge would find it 4.5 centuries later. And when you ask the obvious question, why, you run straight into one of the most honest sentences in all of American archaeology. National Geographic put it plainly not long ago. Researchers, they said, do not know why Cahokia formed, why it grew so powerful, or what finally made its people pick up and leave. You will read confident answers online, and they are worth walking through, because the way this particular mystery has been investigated is a small masterclass in how real science actually works. For years, the fashionable explanation was ecological suicide. The story went that Cahokia cut down too many trees for fuel and construction. The stripped hillsides eroded. The flooding that followed drowned the very city its own people had built. It was a tidy and satisfying tale, and in 2021, a geoarchaeologist named Caitlin Rankin tested it directly, digging into the sediments around the mounds to look for the signature of all that erosion and flooding. She did not find it. The ground beneath Cahokia stayed stable for centuries, right up until the 1800s. The self-inflicted flood, the neat morality play about a civilization destroying its own environment, simply was not supported by the dirt. So one popular answer collapsed. The way answers are supposed to collapse when the evidence says no. What is left is messier and, to my mind, more interesting. There is strong evidence from the river itself. Sediment studies show that Cahokia rose during an unusually calm stretch for the Mississippi, several centuries when the great megafloods that periodically ravaged that valley simply did not come. The city grew fat and huge during the quiet years, and then, after about 1200, the floods returned. The river remembered how to be violent. Add to that a shift toward drought that would have stressed the corn the whole city depended on. Add signs of political fracturing, of the central authority losing its grip, and you get a picture of many pressures stacking up at once. No single catastrophe, until, family by family, people made the oldest decision in the world. They left. They walked to somewhere better. And one more myth-buster, because it matters. Cahokia did not become a haunted no-man's land that no one ever touched again. People moved back into the area within a couple of centuries. The land was not cursed. It was simply, for reasons we are still assembling, no longer worth the enormous effort the great city had demanded. Everything we just described, the urban planning, the astronomy, the trade network, the pyramids of Earth, sat in a place that the myth insisted had been empty wilderness. When Henry Brackenridge stood on top of Monks Mound and could not believe native people had built it, the descendants of the people who did build it were living within a few days' ride of where he stood. The evidence was not hidden. It was under his feet and all around him, and it had a memory attached to it that he was choosing not to ask about. 2. Watson Break, older than the pyramids. But Cahokia, as staggering as it is, was late. It was the grand finale of a tradition that was already unimaginably old by the time those first cedar posts went into the ground. To find where the whole thing started, we have to leave the city behind entirely and go looking for something built by people who had no city at all. No kings, no farms, nothing that any textbook of the last century said you needed in order to build something monumental. To find them, we go south, and we go back in time almost 4,000 years further to a bend in a Louisiana creek. The place is called Watson Break, and it sits in the low, wet country of northeastern Louisiana near the modern town of Monroe. If you drove past it, you would see gentle grassy rises among the trees, 11 of them, arranged in a rough oval and linked together by low ridges, the tallest of the mounds standing maybe 25 feet high. It does not look like much. It looks like a slightly bumpy field. And that ordinary appearance hid, until quite recently, one of the most important dates in the human story of this continent. Because when archaeologists finally pinned down when Watson Break was raised, the answer stopped a lot of careers cold. The oldest construction there is roughly 5,400 years old. 5,400 years. That is older than Stonehenge. Older than the Great Pyramid of Giza, older than every pyramid in Egypt, by centuries. When the people of Watson Brake were shaping these mounds, the pharaohs had not yet been born. Writing itself had barely been invented anywhere on Earth. And here, in a Louisiana floodplain, human beings were already moving tons of soil into deliberate monumental form, and what came next broke the textbook. For most of the 20th century, archaeologists carried a rule around in their heads, a rule that felt as solid as gravity. Monumental architecture, they believed, required a certain kind of society first. You needed agriculture, farming, a food surplus, so that not everyone had to spend all day finding their next meal. You needed social hierarchy, chiefs or kings or priests, someone with the authority to command a large workforce and keep them digging. Cities came first, thinking went, and then, only then, could you get monuments. Pyramids were a symptom of kings. That was the law. Watson Brake breaks the law. The people who built it were not farmers. They grew nothing. They were hunter-gatherers, mobile people who lived off the astonishing natural richness of that river country, the fish and the shellfish, the deer, the seeds, and the nuts. They had no agriculture to speak of, and there is no sign of a king, no palace, no rich central grave, no evidence that some elite forced the labour out of a servant class. What the evidence suggests instead is a rhythm. These people appear to have gathered at the site during certain seasons of the year, worked on the mounds together, added a little more soil, repaired the damage of the previous year, held whatever ceremonies bound them together, and then scattered back into smaller mobile camps so they would not exhaust the land around them. Season after season, generation after generation, they came back and built. Not because a ruler ordered it, because they wanted to. So what does that mean? It means the deep assumption was backwards. The urge to gather and raise something enormous and permanent out of the earth, something bigger than any single family, something that would outlast every person who touched it, does not wait for kings and cities to arrive. It runs older and deeper than that, and it belongs to ordinary people acting together by choice. Watson Brake is proof that the human impulse toward the monumental, toward the sacred and the permanent, was alive and well in North America thousands of years before the first Egyptian dragged the first stone. And the honest open question, the one that hangs over the site to this day, is simply this: why? What did these mounds mean to the people who raised them? They did not bury their dead in them. No one lived on top of them. Whatever purpose Watson Brake served, whatever those seasonal gatherings were reaching toward, the people left no writing to tell us. The wonder is undeniable. The meaning is gone. And that gap between the certainty of the achievement and the silence of its purpose is a gap you are going to feel over and over tonight. 3. Poverty Point. Built without kings. Watson Brake was the first, but it was neither the last of its kind nor the largest. 2,000 years later, in the same corner of Louisiana, the same tradition produced something so ambitious that for most of the last century, when people looked at the aerial photographs, they flatly refused to believe hunter-gatherers could have made it. That place has a strange and slightly sad modern name, taken from a run-down 19th century plantation that once sat on the land. It is called Poverty Point, and there is nothing impoverished about it. Fly over Poverty Point today, and the shape leaps out of the ground at you. 6 enormous concentric ridges, arranged in a set of nested half-circles, like ripples frozen in the earth around a central plaza. Stretched out end to end, these ridges run for miles. The outermost arc measures roughly 3/4 of a mile across. Set among and behind them are several large mounds, including one, Mound A, that stands about 70 feet tall and is shaped, many researchers believe, like an enormous bird in flight. All of this was raised around 3,400 years ago, give or take. And all of it was moved by hand. There is a number that a modern archaeologist named Tristram Kidder, who has spent years of his life on this site, uses to make people understand the scale, and it reorganises your sense of what ancient people were capable of. To build Poverty Point, the workers moved, at a conservative estimate, the equivalent of 140,000 dump truckloads of soil. 140,000. And they moved every basket of it by hand, on a site where no wheel had ever turned and no animal was ever harnessed to a load. They had no metal either, just woven baskets, carried on the back load after load after load, and the earth packed into shape by hand and by foot. And Kidder's research has turned up one more detail that deepens the mystery instead of solving it. In places, The evidence suggests they raised entire mounds astonishingly fast, in a matter of months, not the slow accumulation over centuries that everyone had assumed. Which means large numbers of people were converging on this spot and working in a coordinated frenzy. For a long time, that fact seemed to demand a king. Common sense said you cannot coordinate that much labour, that quickly, without a boss standing over it, some chief with a whip and a ruling class to squeeze the labour out of everyone below. It seemed obvious, and it seems to be wrong. The most recent work by Kidder and his colleagues argues that Poverty Point, like Watson Brake before it, was built by relatively egalitarian hunter-gatherers. There are no palaces here, and no rich graves. Search as hard as you like, and you will not turn up a single burial or any trace of houses that people lived in the year round. That is exactly what you would expect from a great gathering place rather than a lived-in city. The picture emerging is of a site where people travelled from enormous distances, up and down the Mississippi and into the Ohio and Tennessee valleys, to meet and trade and worship and build together. Archaeologists find stone at Poverty Point that came from hundreds of miles away, chert and soapstone and crystal hauled across the ancient southeast to this one spot on a Louisiana ridge. And Kidder adds a further idea that gives the whole place a soul. He points out that when these earthworks were going up, the southeast was a volatile, frightening world, prone to violent weather and catastrophic flooding. And so he suggests these mounds were never monuments to a ruler. They were something closer to a prayer, a massive cooperative act of spiritual labour, an offering raised by frightened people trying to gain some influence over an unpredictable universe. They built together. They held their ceremonies, and they left valuable objects buried in the earth as sacrifices, not to obey a king, to reach the sky. The oldest and grandest earthworks in early North America were not built by the top-down command of god-kings. They were built from the bottom up by free and equal people, moved by shared belief and shared fear, without anyone forcing them. That single idea, that the monumental does not require the tyrannical, quietly demolishes one of the load-bearing assumptions of the whole lost race myth we are circling toward. Because the myth always insisted that Indians were too primitive, too scattered and leaderless to build anything great. And here is Poverty Point saying, from 3,500 years ago, that being leaderless was not a weakness at all. It was how the greatest early works on the continent got made. 4. The Hopewell and the Moon. These builders worked in raw scale. 140,000 loads of earth, ridges you can only comprehend from an airplane. But there was another people, far to the northeast, in the valleys of Ohio, who worked in a different currency entirely. Not scale, precision. And what they encoded into the ground was so subtle and so patient that it would take modern astronomers with modern instruments to even realize it was there. The people we now call the Hopewell lived across the Ohio country and beyond, roughly 2,000 years ago, in the long stretch of centuries around the time of the Roman Empire on the other side of the world. And like the Romans, they were builders of geometry. Across southern Ohio, they laid out earthen enclosures of breathtaking regularity, perfect circles, precise squares, and one shape that has quietly stunned every mathematician who has studied it, a near-flawless octagon. The largest surviving example is at a place called Newark, in central Ohio, where a giant circle joins an enormous octagon across a landscape that once sprawled over more than 4 square miles. To grasp the size, understand that you could set the Roman Colosseum down inside one of these enclosures, and it would look small. These are among the largest geometric earthworks anywhere on the planet, and in 2023, the world finally caught up with their significance, when the United Nations added the Hopewell ceremonial earthworks, Newark among them, to its list of World Heritage Sites, the same list that honours the pyramids and the Acropolis and the Taj Mahal. But the shapes are not the miracle. The miracle is what the shapes are pointing at. In the early 1980s, 2 researchers, an astronomer and a philosopher named Ray Hively and Robert Horn, came to the Newark Octagon expecting to debunk any claims of astronomical alignment. They came away having discovered the opposite. The walls of that octagon, they found, are aligned to the movements of the moon, and not the easy movements, nothing as simple as the daily rising and setting that anyone can watch. The octagon is tuned to one of the most difficult celestial rhythms there is, a cycle so long and so subtle that it has a name most people have never heard. The lunar standstill. It takes 18.6 years to complete. Let me put that in plain language, because it is the heart of why this place matters. Every single month, the point on the horizon where the moon rises drifts back and forth. But layered on top of that monthly drift is a much slower, grander swing. Over the course of about 9 years, the moon's rising points spread wider and wider apart along the horizon, reaching their most extreme north and south positions, and then over the next 9 years they contract back in again. The full cycle, out to the extremes and all the way back, takes 18 years and about 7 months. 18.6 years. And the 8 walls of the Newark octagon are aligned to capture the limits of that entire cycle, the moon's most extreme rises and sets, marked and frozen into the earth. What it took to know that is staggering. There were no telescopes. There were no written records to pass down, no star charts of any kind. People in that era did not live especially long lives. To detect a pattern that takes 18.6 years to repeat, and to measure its extremes precisely enough to build a giant octagon around them, you would need to watch the horizon carefully, night after night, and hand your observations down across generations, from grandparent to child, as a living body of knowledge, memorized and held sacred, accurate enough to survive the deaths of the people who first noticed it. That is not superstition. That is science, done with the naked eye and human memory, sustained across a span of time longer than many marriages. And the descendants of the people who did it were, once again, standing right there in Ohio when the settlers arrived, and were told by those settlers that they were too primitive to have built the very thing their ancestors had used to track the moon. These same people were traders on a continental scale. Inside the Hopewell earthworks and their burials, archaeologists have found obsidian, volcanic glass, that came from the Rocky Mountains, more than 1,000 miles to the west. They found copper hauled down from the Great Lakes, shark's teeth and whelk shells carried up from the Gulf of Mexico, mica from the Appalachians cut into delicate shapes, grizzly bear teeth from the far west. This was a network of exchange and belief that reached across the whole of the eastern half of the continent and beyond, converging on a set of soil monuments in Ohio that doubled as astronomical instruments. And the open question the Hopewell leave us is a tantalizing one. Newark survived. But how many other earthworks, how much other encoded knowledge of the sky, was ploughed flat by farmers in the 18 and 1900s before anyone thought to ask what the shapes were for? How much did we erase before we understood we were erasing anything at all? 5. The Great Serpent Mound. The Hopewell drew the heavens down into geometry, but not far away, on a high bluff above a creek in southern Ohio, a different set of hands drew something else, not another shape, a creature, and it is the single most recognizable ancient monument on the continent, and one of the most stubbornly mysterious. It is called the Great Serpent Mound, and it is exactly what the name promises, an enormous snake, sculpted out of raised earth, uncoiling for nearly a quarter of a mile along the crest of a ridge, 1,348 feet, from the tight spiral of its tail to the open jaws at its head. It is the largest serpent effigy anywhere in the world. The body undulates in great graceful curves, 7 of them, and at the head the mouth gapes open around a large oval, and many who have studied it believe the serpent is in the act of swallowing, or perhaps disgorging, the sun. Because the alignment is not random. The head of the serpent and the oval in its jaws point toward the place on the horizon where the sun sets on the summer solstice, the longest day of the year. Other coils appear to reach toward the extremes of the moon and the winter solstice sunrise. Whoever shaped this animal shaped it to speak to the sky, the same obsession we just saw at Newark, expressed this time in living form instead of geometry. And now the mystery, which is a genuinely delicious one, because it is not a mystery about aliens or lost races. It is a real, unresolved scientific fight about a single question. When was it built? And by whom? For a long time, archaeologists assumed the serpent was the work of the Adena culture, an early people who lived in the Ohio Valley more than 2,000 years ago, mainly because there are known Adena burial mounds sitting right nearby. It was a reasonable guess based on the neighbourhood. Then, in 1991, someone finally did the hard science. Radiocarbon dating on bits of charcoal pulled from inside the serpent's body came back with a shocking result. Not 2,000 years old, about 900 years old, a date around the year 1070, which would mean the builders were not the ancient Adena at all. They were a much later people, the Fort Ancient culture, who lived in that country around the time the Normans were conquering England. The textbooks were rewritten. the serpent became a Fort Ancient monument, and then it flipped again. In 2014, a different team took new samples, and their results swung the pendulum all the way back, pointing to a construction date around 300 years before Christ, squarely in the Adena period, roughly where the original guess had been. That early date was supported again by further work in 2019. So now we have two careful, modern studies using the same basic technique, arriving at dates more than 1,000 years apart. 1,000 years. That is the gap between a Roman legionary and a medieval knight, and the experts cannot close it. The likeliest reconciliation, and it is a beautiful one, is that both are true. The theory that many archaeologists now favour is that the serpent was originally laid out and built by the Adena more than 2,000 years ago, and then, a full millennium later, the Fort Ancient people found it, recognised what it was, and took up its care, rebuilding and refurbishing it, maintaining across 1,000 years of changing cultures a single unbroken thread of reverence for this one sacred animal on this one ridge. If that is right, then the Serpent Mound is not a monument from one moment. It is a relationship tended across more than 1,000 years by different peoples who all agreed that this place and this shape mattered. And no one, not the Adena, not the Fort Ancient, left us a single word explaining what the serpent meant or why it swallows the sun. We can measure it to the inch. We cannot read its mind. Decide for yourself which is the deeper mystery, the date we cannot fix, or the meaning we will never recover. 6. Moundville, the city of the dead. Everything we have seen so far has been in the east and the south, the country of the mound builders, of earth piled into pyramids and animals and observatories. The serpent keeps its meaning locked behind a wall of time. But not every mystery of the mound builders is about something we have lost. Some are about a choice we can see perfectly clearly in the ground and still cannot explain. For one of the strangest of those, we follow the Mississippian world south, down into Alabama, to a place that did something no living city is ever supposed to do. It stopped being a home for the living and turned itself into a home for the dead. Moundville sits on a bluff above the Black Warrior River in central Alabama. In its prime, around 800 years ago, it was the second greatest city in the entire Mississippian world, ranked just behind Cahokia itself in size and power and splendour. Nearly 30 flat-topped earthen mounds stood arranged with obvious care around one enormous central plaza. The whole 300-acre town wrapped on three sides by a heavy wooden palisade studded with guard towers, and shielded on the fourth side by the river itself. On the tallest mounds stood the homes of the nobility, physically lifted above everyone else, and among them smaller mounds carried temples and the buildings of the dead. At its height, around the year 1300, roughly 1,000 people lived inside the town, with perhaps 10,000 more spread through the farming settlements up and down the river valley that fed it. National Geographic once nicknamed it, only half joking, the Big Apple of the 14th century. And Moundville was a place of breathtaking art. Its people were masters of a shared sacred tradition that scholars call the Southeastern Ceremonial Complex, a body of religious imagery that stretched across the whole Mississippian South. Their single most famous surviving masterpiece is a carved stone disc, found in the 1800s by a local farmer, about a foot across, its polished surface engraved with two rattlesnakes, horned and knotted together in an interlocking coil, framing a haunting image at the centre. A human hand, palm open, with a single staring eye set into it. The eye in the hand. Nobody can tell you with certainty what it meant, though the symbol appears again and again across the Mississippian world, and most who study it believe it points toward the heavens, toward a doorway between the world of the living and the world of the spirits. It is one of the supreme works of art produced anywhere in ancient North America, and it was made by exactly the people the settlers would later swear had never been capable of anything but savagery. But Moundville did something that sets it apart from every other place we have visited tonight. Around the year 1250 or 1300, at the very peak of its wealth and power, the town began to empty of living people. But not because it was failing, because it was changing into something else. As the ordinary residents, the commoners and the lesser nobles gradually moved out into the surrounding countryside, the dead moved in. The number of burials at Moundville rose, even as the number of the living fell. Slowly and deliberately, across generations, the great capital stopped being a place where people lived their daily lives and became a vast sacred necropolis, a city of the dead, run and controlled by the elite as a ceremonial centre to which the scattered people of the whole valley carried their dead to be buried at last among the mounds of their ancestors. That is a strange thing for any city to do. We know the usual pattern. A city rises, it thrives for a while, and then it falls into ruin and gets left behind. The story of Cahokia and Chaco, and so many of the places we have walked through. Moundville did something rarer and eerier. It converted itself, on purpose, from a living capital into a holy graveyard, and it went on functioning that way for a long time after the crowds had gone. The earthen pyramids that had once looked down on a busy, crowded town now looked down over a silent field of the dead, tended by priests and visited by mourners, honoured by a people who no longer lived there but could not bring themselves to let it go. And then, in time, even that faded. Over the century from about 1350 to 1450, Moundville was gradually and almost completely abandoned. And why, once again, no one can fully say. You know the suspects by now, and they gather here too. Soil worn thin by centuries of farming the same ground. A shrinking harvest of the corn the whole system depended on. The internal strains of a rigid and deeply unequal chiefly society that may simply have lost its hold on the people beneath it. Whatever the true mix, the unravelling of Moundville was already far advanced long before any European laid eyes on it. When the Spanish conquistador Hernando de Soto dragged his armoured column through that country around 1540, hunting for gold and leaving disease and cruelty behind him, the great centre was very likely already a hollow shell, its power broken a full century before he ever arrived. Something was quietly pulling the whole Mississippian South apart in those pre-Columbian centuries, the same great continental unravelling we keep colliding with, and we still cannot put a single name to it. But the people of Moundville, like every people we have met tonight, did not evaporate. They dispersed along the river valleys, carried their art and their beliefs with them, and their descendants are counted today among the great native nations of the southeast, the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, the Muskogee Creek, and others, whose oral traditions still hold faint echoes of the world that raised those mounds. The eye in the hand, staring out of that engraved stone, was never a message from a vanished race. It was the sacred art of a people whose grandchildren are alive this very evening, in Oklahoma and Alabama and Mississippi, and who have not forgotten. 7. Chaco Canyon and the Hidden Dynasty. But the ancient genius of this continent was not confined to the wet river valleys. Far to the west, in a high desert so dry and so harsh that it seems to actively resist human life, another civilization built something that has no parallel anywhere in North America. Straight roads, aligned cities, a dynasty, and a connection to a land more than 1,000 miles away that no one saw coming. Chaco Canyon lies in the high desert of northwestern New Mexico, and to understand why it is one of the strangest sights in the Americas, you first have to understand where it is. This is not fertile ground. It is a bleak, wind-scoured canyon, brutally hot in summer and bitterly cold in winter, with thin soil and almost no water or timber. It is, by almost any measure, one of the least inviting places you could choose to build a great centre of civilization. And around 1100 years ago, a people we call the ancestral Puebloans chose it anyway, and built there something that still does not fully make sense. They raised what archaeologists call great houses, and the word house does not do them justice. The largest, Pueblo Bonito, was a single-planned building containing something like 650 rooms, rising in places 4 and 5 stories high, curved in a vast D shape against the canyon wall. For roughly 7 centuries, from its construction until the 1700s, Pueblo Bonito held a record that ought to be famous. It was the largest building in what is now the United States. Nothing taller or bigger was raised on this land until European Americans started putting up large structures in the 17 and 1800s. A people with no written language and no draft animals designed and constructed apartment complexes on a scale the young United States could not match for centuries, and they connected these great houses with roads. This is one of the eeriest features of the whole Chaco world. Radiating out from the canyon, across miles of open, empty desert, run wide, deliberately engineered roads, some of them 30 feet across, and they run dead straight. They do not curve to follow the easy contours of the land. They drive straight over hills and through obstacles, as if the straightness itself was the point, as if these were something more than practical routes for walking, ceremonial lines connecting sacred places across the land. Some of them seem to lead to nowhere in particular, running out into the desert toward the horizon, and the buildings themselves are aligned, like the octagon and the serpent before them, to the sun and to the moon, including, once again, that same slow 18.6-year lunar standstill cycle that so obsessed the builders of Ohio, tracked here independently in a desert 1,000 miles away. Chaco holds a burial every bit as astonishing as the beaded burial of Cahokia, and it tells us something profound about who really held power in the ancient Southwest. Deep inside Pueblo Bonito, in the oldest part of the complex, there is a tiny chamber, barely 6 feet by 6 feet, that could only be entered through a small hatch in the roof. Archaeologists working there in 1896 opened it and found 14 human beings buried inside, stacked in the little room across a span of centuries, separated by layers of sand and wooden flooring. And the 2 men at the very bottom, the founders of this crypt, had been buried in unimaginable splendour. One of them, a man who had died from a hard blow to the head, was laid to rest wearing and surrounded by more than 11,000 turquoise beads, along with thousands more beads of polished shell, an abalone carried from the distant Pacific, and a conch shell trumpet from the Gulf of California. It is, to this day, the single richest burial ever found anywhere in the American Southwest. Whoever this man was, he was, in the language of the researchers who study him, an enormous deal. But the true revelation waited until 2017, when scientists were finally able to recover ancient DNA from the bodies in that room. And the DNA told a story no one could have read from the bones alone. 9 of the individuals in the crypt, buried over a period of roughly 330 years, all shared the same maternal lineage. The exact same mitochondrial DNA, the genetic signature passed down only through mothers. Among them, the researchers could identify a mother and her daughter, and a grandmother and her grandson. What that means is staggering in its clarity. For more than 3 centuries, this most sacred and elite burial chamber in the entire Pueblo world was reserved for the members of a single family, a dynasty, and crucially, membership in that dynasty was reckoned through the women. Power at Chaco Canyon passed down the female line. This matters on 2 levels. First, it demolishes another old assumption. Scholars had long imagined the ancestral Pueblans as a loosely egalitarian people with no real rulers, because many of their descendants govern communally today. Instead, we find a hereditary aristocracy, a ruling bloodline holding its crypt for over 300 years. And second, that female line inheritance is not some lost alien practice. It is exactly how many living Pueblo peoples, the Zuni and others, still organize their clans today, with descent and belonging traced through the mother. So the ancient dynasty in that hidden room is not a riddle without an answer. Its answer is walking around in New Mexico right now. The people whose clan structure mirrors that 1,000-year-old crypt are alive, and they never went anywhere. That is the hammer that falls at the end of the night. And Chaco's reach did not stop at the edge of the desert. 2 discoveries there connect this canyon to a civilization far to the south, in Mexico, in a way that reorganizes the whole map of ancient North America. First, the macaws. In the ruins of Pueblo Bonito, archaeologists found the skeletons of scarlet macaws, brilliant red tropical parrots, birds whose natural home is the rainforests of southern Mexico and Central America, more than 1,000 miles away. And the newest dating shows these birds were being carried north into the New Mexico desert startlingly early, by around the year 900, generations before the canyon reached its peak. Someone was running live tropical parrots across 1,000 miles of mountain and desert, keeping them alive because in Chacoan society those birds were sacred and precious. Second, the chocolate. Residue analysis of tall cylindrical jars found at Pueblo Bonito turned up traces of cacao, the raw material of chocolate, which does not grow anywhere near New Mexico and could only have come from Mesoamerica. In a stone great house, in a brutal high desert, the elite of Chaco Canyon were drinking chocolate from ceremonial vessels, chocolate imported across 1,000 miles from the same broad world that produced the Maya and the Aztec. This was not an isolated backwater. It was a northern node in a web of trade and belief that stretched deep into the heart of the Americas. One uncomfortable, honest note here, because it strengthens everything else rather than weakening it. That 2017 DNA study, as brilliant as it was, drew real criticism. The researchers had not fully consulted the living Pueblo, Navajo, Hopi and Zuni communities before taking genetic samples from the bones of what are, to those communities, ancestors, not specimens, ancestors, and that tension between the hunger of science to know and the right of living peoples to protect their own dead is one that modern archaeology is still working through, out in the open, arguing about it in journals and at conference tables. I raise it because it is the exact opposite of the story the conspiracy channels want to sell you. They tell you archaeology is a machine for hiding the truth about Native America. What archaeology actually is, at its messy best, is a field openly wrestling with how to handle a truth it already knows, which is that these ruins belong to people who are still here, because that, in the end, is the Chaco mystery. Around the 1200s, the great houses were emptied and never fully reoccupied, and you will read that the Chacones deforested themselves, chopped down all their trees and doomed their world, the same tidy morality tale that got told about Cahokia. And just like at Cahokia, the science said no. A 2014 study out of the University of New Mexico looked hard for the evidence of local deforestation and did not find it. A savage drought in the middle 1100s is a leading suspect for why people began to leave. But the full story of why they abandoned the canyon and where those dead straight roads were really meant to lead remains genuinely open. What is not open, what is settled beyond any serious doubt, is where the people went. They did not vanish. They moved. And their descendants are the Pueblo peoples of today, the Hopi, the Zuni, the people of the Rio Grande villages, who carry oral traditions that reach back to Chaco, and whose matrilineal clans still echo that ancient dynasty in the hidden room. As recently as 2025, a genetic study of the living Picuris Pueblo, done this time in full partnership with the tribe at their own request, confirmed a direct biological link between today's Picuris people and the ancient inhabitants of that world. The descendants asked the question themselves, and the answer came back. We are still here. We always were. 8. Mesa Verde and the word disappeared. Which brings us to the largest and most famous act of leaving in all of ancestral Puebloan history, and to one of the most misunderstood words in American archaeology, the word disappearance. Because just north of Chaco, in the canyons of southwestern Colorado, the same people built something out of the cliffs themselves that draws 500,000 visitors a year, and then, around the year 1300, they walked away from it so completely that for centuries afterward, people insisted they had simply ceased to exist. Mesa Verde means green table in Spanish, and it is a high, forested plateau rising out of the Colorado desert, cut through with deep canyons, and tucked into the sheer walls of those canyons, sheltered under great natural overhangs of rock hundreds of feet above the canyon floors, the ancestral Puebloans built villages out of sandstone and mortar that look, even now, like something out of a dream. The most famous is called Cliff Palace, and it is a genuine town wedged into a cliff alcove. Roughly 150 rooms and 23 of the round ceremonial chambers called kivas, home to something like 100 to 150 people. Its towers and walls fitted so perfectly into the curve of the rock that the building and the mountain seemed to be one thing. There are more than 600 of these cliff dwellings scattered through the park, and over 4,000 archaeological sites in all. It is the largest archaeological preserve in the United States. The first strange thing about it, these spectacular cliff dwellings, the ones the whole world comes to see, were lived in for less than 100 years. For most of their history, the Mesa Verde people had actually lived up on top of the plateau, out in the open, farming the mesa tops. Then, somewhere around the middle of the 1200s, they did something that took enormous effort and makes you stop and wonder what they were afraid of. They abandoned the easy open ground on top and moved down into the cliffs. They gave up convenient homes to build fortress-like villages in places that could only be reached by climbing hand and toe up the bare rock face. You do not do that for the view. You do that when you feel you need to defend yourselves, when the world has become dangerous enough that living in a place you can pull the ladder up behind you starts to sound like a good idea. And then, within about 2 generations of moving into those hard-won cliff strongholds, they left those too. By around the year 1300, the whole of Mesa Verde stood empty. Cliff Palace, silent. The kivas, cold. An entire cultural world 7 centuries deep in that landscape, packed up and gone in the span of a few decades. So what happened? The evidence points once again to a stacking of pressures rather than a single blow. Tree rings, which record the wet years and the dry years in the width of their growth, tell us of a devastating drought that gripped the region from about 1276 to 1299, the so-called Great Drought. More than 20 straight years of failing rains, in a place where farming was already a gamble. Add the strain of centuries of intensive use, of soil and forests and game slowly wearing thin. There are signs, too, of rising conflict, that fearful retreat into the cliffs, evidence at some sites of violence, of people fighting over a shrinking supply of food and water. Stack all of that together and you get a slow-motion catastrophe, a homeland that simply stopped being able to keep its people alive, and a population that became, in the truest sense, refugees, streaming south and east in search of somewhere that still had water. But the word that got attached to all of this for 100 years was the wrong word, and it is the word I want to burn down tonight. The word is disappeared. Generations of Americans grew up being told that the cliff dwellers of Mesa Verde mysteriously vanished, that they built these gorgeous, impossible cities and then evaporated off the face of the earth, leaving empty rooms and unanswered questions. You will still hear it phrased that way. The mysterious lost people who disappeared, they did not disappear, not for one moment. They walked south into New Mexico and Arizona and joined their relatives who were already living there, the same broad migration we traced out of Chaco. They became the Hopi and the Zuni. They are the people of the Rio Grande Pueblos today, Acoma, Taos, Santo Domingo, and the rest. Communities that have lived continuously in the southwest from that day to this one. When modern Pueblo people are asked about Mesa Verde, they do not scratch their heads at an ancient enigma. They say, plainly and a little wearily, those were our ancestors, and we are still here. The buildings were emptied. The people were not erased. There is an enormous, meaningful difference between those two things, and almost the entire mythology of a mysterious vanished southwest depends on blurring them together. I keep returning to this because it is the quiet engine under everything tonight. Over and over, from the Mississippi to the Colorado, we find the same shape, a great achievement, an abandonment we cannot fully explain, which is a real and honest mystery, and then, bolted on top of the real mystery, a fake one, the myth of disappearance, of vanished peoples and lost races which exists for one reason. It is far more comfortable to marvel at a mystery than to admit you are standing in a house whose owners you helped drive out, and whose grandchildren are still down the road. 9. The Hohokam who moved the rivers. We turn even further into the desert now, into the hardest country of all, the low, blistering Sonoran desert of southern Arizona, where summer temperatures crack past 115 degrees, and rain is a rumour. No one in their right mind builds a civilization here, and yet a people did, and they did it by performing an act of engineering so audacious that when American settlers stumbled on the evidence, they too refused to believe native hands had done it. They are called the Hohokam, and their story is in a way the most quietly incredible of all, because their monument was not a pyramid or a temple, it was water. They looked at one of the driest stretches of ground in North America, a place with two rivers, the Salt and the Gila, running through an ocean of sand, and they decided to move the rivers, by hand. Over the course of roughly 1,000 years, the Hohokam dug the largest and most sophisticated system of irrigation canals in the entire ancient New World. Not a few ditches, a network. Their canals stretched for hundreds of miles across the desert around what is now Phoenix, and the total mileage, when you add it all up, runs to something like 500 miles of engineered waterway. The main canals were enormous, some of them 15 feet deep and 30 feet wide, big enough that you could lose a house in one. They built headgates to control the flow, and they surveyed the land so precisely that the water ran downhill at exactly the right gentle gradient across mile after mile of terrain, slow enough not to erode the channel, fast enough not to sit and evaporate, and they did every foot of it with stone tools, wooden digging sticks, and woven baskets to haul the dirt. No metal, no machines, and nothing alive to pull the load but people. Just an intimate generational understanding of their desert and an almost unbelievable amount of collective work. That system watered tens of thousands of acres of corn, beans, squash, and cotton, and it turned a place that should not support a village into the home of a civilization for 1,000 years. At the heart of Hohokam country stood buildings like the one we now call Casa Grande, Spanish for great house, a massive 4-story structure of hardened desert clay, raised around the year 1350, built so solidly that it still stands in the open Arizona sun nearly 700 years later, after centuries with no roof and no repair. And like so many of the places we have visited tonight, Casa Grande watched the sky. High in its walls are openings positioned so that sunlight and moonlight pass through them at particular moments of the year, including what researchers read as an alignment tied to that same 18.6-year lunar cycle we met in Ohio and again in New Mexico. 3 different peoples, in 3 different corners of the continent, all independently patient enough to catch the slowest heartbeat of the moon and build it into stone and earth. And then, around 1450, the Hohokam world came apart. And this may be the purest mystery in the whole of North America, because the usual suspects all have alibis. The canals fell out of use. The great houses were abandoned. The distinctive culture, its red-on buff pottery and its ball courts and its irrigation empire faded from the record. And the maddening thing is that we cannot say why with any confidence at all. Drought. These were people who had farmed that desert for over 1,000 years. They had ridden out droughts before. Floods, which could tear out canal headworks. They had rebuilt after floods for centuries, salt building up in the over-irrigated soil. They understood their own land better than anyone. War or plague? There is no clear evidence of a mass grave, no obvious sign of an epidemic or an invasion. Every simple explanation runs into the fact that these people were experts at survival in that place, and had been for a millennium, right up until they weren't. There is something almost unbearably poignant in the very name we use for them. Hohokam is not what they called themselves. It comes from the language of the Odom people, the native inhabitants of that same desert, and it means, depending on how you translate it, those who have gone or those who are used up. That name was given by the descendants, because that is the final mythbuster, the same one that has followed us across the entire continent. The Hohokam did not truly vanish either. The best evidence, and the oral tradition of the people themselves, holds that when the great centres broke apart, the population scattered and carried on, and their descendants are the Akimel o Odom and the Tohono o Odom, the river people and the desert people, who farm and live in southern Arizona to this very day, some of them still using the paths of those ancient canals. The engineers who moved the rivers have grandchildren. What was used up was a way of life, an enormous cooperative project. Not a race of people. The people are still there. 10. Spiro. The looted treasure. We have gone from the Mississippi to Louisiana to Ohio to New Mexico to Colorado to Arizona. But before we finally turn and face the lie that has been shadowing us the whole way, there are a few more places I have to show you because each one delivers a different kind of shock. The first is a mound in Oklahoma that hid, for 500 years, an American treasure to rival the tomb of a pharaoh. And the story of how it was found is one of the great tragedies of American archaeology. Spiro sits in the far eastern corner of Oklahoma, along the Arkansas River, and in its day, roughly 1,000 years ago, it was one of the great ceremonial capitals of the Mississippian world, the same broad civilization that produced Cahokia. It was not the biggest of those centres. What made Spiro extraordinary was what it held. Among its dozen earthen mounds was one, Craig Mound, that was used for the burial of the elite. And inside Craig Mound, over centuries, the people of Spiro created something that exists nowhere else in North American archaeology. They built a great hollow chamber deep within the mound. A cone of sacred cedar posts leaned together like the frame of an enormous teepee, packed around and over with tons of earth. And by some accident of chemistry, of the minerals seeping through that soil and hardening the walls, the inside of that chamber became a sealed, bone-dry space, a room where time nearly stopped. Archaeologists call it the Great Mortuary, and because of that freak preservation, it held things that simply do not survive 500 years in the wet earth of North America. Stone and shell and copper, of course, but also the perishable heart of a civilization, the things that always rot away and leave us guessing. Woven baskets, fabric and lace, fur, feathers, entire feather capes, objects of wood, carved and inlaid. It was as close as this continent has ever come to opening an intact ancient tomb, with its fragile contents still whole. One newspaper of the day reached for the only comparison big enough and called Spiro the King Tut of the Arkansas Valley, after the Egyptian pharaoh whose sealed tomb had stunned the world just a decade earlier. And the contents proved something the myth of the primitive savage could never survive. The Great Mortuary was stuffed with the finest art of the Mississippian world, engraved conch shell cups and gorgets etched with astonishing skill, embossed copper plates showing costumed warriors and winged beings, effigy pipes carved into human and animal forms, pearl beads by the tens of thousands. And exactly as we saw at Cahokia and Chaco and Newark, the raw materials had travelled from the ends of the continent. Copper came down from the Great Lakes. Conch and whelk shell arrived from the Gulf of Mexico, and from as far as the California coast. There was flint from the Rockies and obsidian from Mexico. More than 60 distinct peoples and regions fed into this one chamber. Spiro was a hub, a spiritual and economic crossroads plugged into trade routes that laced together the whole of North America. Some scholars estimate that 90% of all the finely engraved shell art we have from the entire Mississippian civilization came out of this single mound. One room in Oklahoma held nearly the complete surviving artistic record of a continental religion. And then the tragedy, told straight, because it is important and because it is another lesson in who has actually done the erasing in American history. The people of Spiro left the site around 1450, in a decline probably driven, like so many others, by drought and the unravelling of the old order. The mound sat undisturbed for almost 500 years, and then, in the depths of the Great Depression, in 1933, a group of local men formed a company, paid a landowner a few $100s for the digging rights, and tunnelled into Craig Mound with dynamite and shovels, hunting for treasure to sell. Oklahoma had no laws yet to stop them. They broke into the Great Mortuary, and over about 2 years they gutted it. They pulled out the artefacts and sold them off to private collectors around the world, scattering a priceless, irreplaceable collection to the winds, and the things they could not easily sell, the fragile textiles, the feathers, the basketry, the very things that made the site a once-in-history miracle of preservation and the human remains of the honoured dead themselves, they threw aside as worthless. They are said to have destroyed roughly a third of everything in the mound. The outrage over that destruction is what finally pushed Oklahoma to pass its first laws protecting ancient sites, and the diggers were shut down in 1935, but the damage was done. Much of the greatest treasure in the archaeological history of the United States was lost within a couple of years of being found, not by any native hand, by treasure hunters with dynamite. Spiro's people too are still with us. Their descendants are counted among the Caddo Nation, the Wichita, and related peoples of Oklahoma, who help interpret the site today. And Spiro leaves us with its own aching open question, the same one that haunts Cahokia and Chaco and the Hohokam. Why did such a rich and connected centre empty out in the 1400s in what looks like a broad unravelling of the whole Mississippian Templetown world in the century or two before Europeans arrived? Something was happening across the eastern half of the continent in those years, a great loosening, a fading of the old ceremonial capitals, and we still cannot fully name it. Whatever it was already old news by the time the first Spanish and French explorers showed up expecting to find the builders, and instead found the grandchildren living differently among the ruins. 11. The Effigy Mounds. But before we leave the mound builders behind, there is one more corner of their world I have to show you, and it may be the strangest looking of all, because far to the north of Spiro, up along the high bluffs of the upper Mississippi in what is now Wisconsin and Iowa, a different people spent centuries shaping the earth into living creatures instead of pyramids and platforms. Bears, birds with wings spread wide, long sinuous water spirits with tails that run for 100 feet, thousands upon thousands of them, and after more than a century of study we still cannot fully say why. They are called effigy mounds, an effigy being simply an image or a likeness, and they are unique in all the world. Native peoples raised mounds all across the eastern half of the continent, as we have seen all night, but only here, in a compact region centered on southern Wisconsin and spilling into Iowa, Minnesota, and Illinois, did a culture regularly sculpt the ground into the deliberate shapes of animals. The Wisconsin Historical Society has catalogued more than 3,200 of these animal-shaped mounds, and Wisconsin sits at the dead center of the distribution, with more effigy mound sites than anywhere else on Earth. They were built mostly in what archaeologists call the late woodland period, roughly between the years 600 and 1200, by people we now call, a little helplessly, the effigy mound builders. Stand at the edge of one and at first you might see nothing but a low, grassy rise, a swell in the ground barely a couple of feet high. But trace the line of it, let your eye follow the curve, and the swell resolves into a shape. A great bear, walking, its head and legs and haunches unmistakable, 40 and 50 and 60 feet from nose to tail. A bird with a wingspan that can stretch past 200 feet, longer than a city block, laid flat into a hilltop. A panther, a turtle, a lizard, a creature with a long undulating body that researchers call a water spirit. The largest surviving bear at Effigy Mounds National Monument in Iowa runs about 42 meters from head to tail, well over 100 feet of deliberate sculpted animal, raised by hand out of the soil of a Mississippi bluff, and the shapes were not random. The people who built them appear to have been mapping a spiritual universe onto the land. Across many native traditions of that region, the cosmos was divided into worlds, an upper world of the sky and its powers, associated with birds, and a lower world of water and earth, associated with the horned or long-tailed water spirits, with the world of living people held in the balance between them. So when you find bird effigies grouped on the high ground and water spirit effigies down toward the wetlands and the rivers, you may be looking at a deliberate arrangement, a religious map, a way of ordering the whole visible world and the invisible one behind it, written into the earth in the shape of its animals. The bluffs where these mounds sit are stunning, high above the Mississippi, with enormous views, and it is easy to feel, standing there, that these were sacred places chosen with tremendous care. And this is where the mystery deepens rather than resolves, and it is a genuine one. These are not, for the most part, the rich tombs of a powerful elite, where the Hopewell packed their dead into mounds with copper and mica and pearls, and Spiro built a whole treasure chamber. The effigy mound builders did the opposite. Many of their mounds contain no burials at all, and where they do, the burials are strikingly plain. A person or two laid in the earth with almost nothing, no hoard of grave goods, no sign of kings or a ruling class. These were not the works of a wealthy stratified empire. They appear once again to be the works of relatively small, relatively equal communities of hunters and gatherers and part-time gardeners, who nonetheless came together, season after season, to move earth into the shape of a bear the length of a house. And nobody can tell you with certainty what for. The leading ideas are careful and humble, which is exactly how you can tell they come from real archaeology, rather than the fantasy kind. Perhaps the effigies were the emblems of clans, a bear clan raising bears, a bird clan raising birds, marking the land as their own. Maybe they were gathering places where scattered bands met at certain times of the year, to trade and arrange marriages, to bury their dead and renew the bonds that held a dispersed people together. Or the very act of building them, the communal labour of shaping a sacred animal, was itself a form of prayer and world renewal, a way of keeping the powers of the sky and the water in their proper balance. It is very likely some blend of all these things, differing from group to group and century to century, but no one left a written word, and so the honest answer, the one an honest guide has to give you, is that we know these people built beauty into the earth on an enormous scale, and we do not fully know why. There is a comparison people reach for, and it is a fair one. These animal figures, meant to be appreciated in their full form from above, laid across the land on a scale no single person on the ground could take in at once, have been likened to the famous Nazca lines of Peru. And that comparison is going to carry us to our very last site, because the idea at the heart of it, an ancient people shaping gigantic figures into the earth to be read from the sky, does not stop at the Mississippi. It reappears, in an even more extreme form, more than 1,500 miles to the west, in one of the harshest deserts on the continent. The effigy mounds also leave us with one last painful echo of everything this video is about. These are sacred sites to many living native nations whose ancestors built them and who still hold them holy. And that sacredness has not always been respected, even in our own time, even by the very institutions charged with protecting them. The mounds have been ploughed under by farmers, bulldozed by developers, and, in one case that came to light not long ago, damaged by an official at the national monument meant to safeguard them. Of the tens of thousands of these mounds that once covered the upper Midwest, only a fraction survive. The rest were erased, not by the people who built them, by those who came after, who could not or would not see what they were destroying. It is the whole story of this video in miniature, a genuine wonder, raised by native hands, a meaning we can only partly recover, and a long hard history of that wonder being taken or ground away by people who preferred not to understand it. 12. The Blythe Giants. So for our last stop before the reckoning, we hold on to that single idea of figures shaped into the earth to be seen from above, and we carry it into the desert of the lower Colorado River on the border between California and Arizona to look at something you cannot really look at from the ground at all. Something that stayed invisible to the outside world until human beings learned how to fly. On the morning of the 12th of November, 1931, a pilot named George Palmer was flying across the Colorado Desert on the route between the Hoover Dam country and Los Angeles, when he looked down and saw giants, enormous human figures lying on the desert floor beneath him, along with animals and coiling shapes scraped into the earth on a scale that took his breath away. He reported it, a survey followed, and the outside world learned for the first time about the Blythe Intaglios. What makes them so uncanny is that they had been lying there in the open for centuries, maybe far longer, and virtually no one outside the native peoples of that desert had ever noticed them, because from the ground they are almost impossible to see. You would walk right across one and register nothing but scattered rocks and dirt. They only resolve into figures when you rise up and look down. You have to be in the sky. There are over 200 of these ground drawings scattered through the Colorado Desert of California and Arizona, the only desert intaglios of their kind in all of North America, and the Blythe group is the most famous. They include 3 human figures, a couple of 4-legged animals, and a long coiling form that may be a serpent. The largest human figure stretches 171 feet from head to foot. That is longer than a Boeing airliner, and the way they were made is beautifully simple and almost unimaginably patient. The desert floor there is covered in a thin layer of dark, sun-varnished stones, what geologists call desert pavement, sitting on top of lighter soil. To make a figure, the artist carefully scraped away the dark stones to expose the pale earth beneath, drawing in negative, and then they piled the removed stones along the edges to outline the shape. Every line of the figure is really an absence, the pale ground left behind once the dark stones were lifted away. They laid it out so accurately that the human form is unmistakable from the air, working entirely from ground level, never once able to step back and see the whole of what they were making. Which brings us to the questions, and they are all still open. Who made them? We know it was the native peoples of the lower Colorado River, but pinning it to a specific culture has proven frustratingly hard. Many researchers point to the Patayan, who lived in that region for many centuries, or to the ancestors of the peoples who live there still, the Mojave and the Quechan. When was it done? Nobody can say for certain, because bare scraped earth is extraordinarily difficult to date, and estimates run anywhere from a few centuries to a couple of thousand years old. And the deepest question, the one that matters most, why? Why make something magnificent and huge that you yourself can never properly see? For that one, the living descendants offer the most compelling answer we have, and it is not really a mystery to them at all. To the Mojave and the Quechan peoples, the great human figures represent Mastamho, the creator, the one who made all life. The animal figures are tied to Hatakulia, a mountain lion being who took part in the creation. These are not idle doodles or messages meant for other humans on the ground. They are sacred images, meant to be seen from above, made for the powers that look down, and the very act of making them, the communal labour of scraping a creator god into the living desert, may have been the whole point, as much as any finished picture. The Colorado River, before it was dammed and diverted in the 20th century, would flood the valley each spring into a shining inland sea, and these figures on their raised terraces would have looked out over that water. There is a whole cosmology encoded here, in a medium so faint that a tank could roll across it and barely leave a mark, which tragically is nearly what happened. During the Second World War, General Patton trained his armoured divisions in that desert, and the tracks of military vehicles scarred some of the figures before anyone thought to protect them. One last honest wrinkle, the kind of detail that separates real history from the tidy fake kind. Some of the native groups living along the Colorado today say plainly that their own people did not make the intaglios, though they have long used and revered the sites, which only deepens the genuine puzzle. Here the humility is real. We do not fully know who made them, and the people who live there now are honest about the limits of what they can claim. That is what an actual open question looks like, and it could not be more different from what comes next, because we are almost at the part of the night where a very different kind of mystery was manufactured on purpose, to hide an answer that was never in doubt. 13. The Lake Superior Copper. There is one more thread I have to pull before we get there, and unlike everything else tonight, this one runs underground. It runs, in fact, straight through nearly every site we have visited. Because if you were paying close attention, you heard the same word again and again at Cahokia, at the Hopewell earthworks, at Spiro, copper. Copper wrapped around the wooden staffs in the beaded burial, copper plates embossed with warriors in the great mortuary, and that copper had a home. It came, overwhelmingly, from one place, the shores of Lake Superior, more than 1,000 miles from most of the graves it ended up in. And the story of where it came from is one of the oldest and most quietly staggering industrial enterprises in the ancient world. Along the south shore of Lake Superior, on the Keweenaw Peninsula of what is now Michigan, and out on the wild, isolated island of Isle Royale, the ground itself holds something almost unique on Earth. Native copper. Not copper ore that has to be smelted out of rock in a furnace, but pure metallic copper, 99% pure, sitting in veins and nuggets you could pick up off the ground or hammer straight out of the stone. And starting an astonishingly long time ago, at least 5,000 years back, and by some evidence closer to 6,000 or 7,000, the native peoples of the Great Lakes began to mine it. This is what archaeologists call the Old Copper Complex, and it counts among the earliest metalworking anywhere on Earth. We usually picture the first metalworkers somewhere in the ancient Middle East. This was happening at the same kind of depth in time, here, in the North Woods of America. The scale of it is hard to take in. Across the Keweenaw and on Isle Royale, ancient miners dug thousands of pits. Thousands, some of them reaching more than 20 feet down into solid rock. They had a brilliant technique. They would light fires against the rock face to heat it, then throw cold water on it to crack it, and then pound the loosened copper free with rounded beach cobbles, hammer stones, which they left behind by the countless thousands, still lying in and around the old pits where the workers set them down. On Isle Royale alone, more than 1,000 of these ancient pits have been found, and the old mining records from that country describe something that stops you cold. A single mass of native copper weighing around 3 tons that the ancient miners had cut loose from the rock, hammered and worked over by hand, and then raised up out of the ground on a cradle of oak timbers, and for some reason simply left behind. Oak did not grow in that country. The wood had been carried in from somewhere else to help move the copper. The miners propped up their prize, and then they walked away and never came back for it. Modern science has now confirmed the intensity of this work in an ingenious way. When you heat and hammer copper, you release traces of lead into the air, and that lead settles into the mud at the bottom of nearby lakes, layer by layer, year by year. Geologists drilled into those lake beds and read the pollution record like tree rings, and they found a massive spike in metal pollution around 6,000 years ago. A 1,000-year boom of industrial-scale copper working, detectable in the environment itself. These were not a few people casually picking up nuggets. This was an organised, generations-deep mining operation, run, once again, by archaic hunter-gatherers, the very kind of people the old textbooks insisted were incapable of organised enterprise. And then, around 3,000 years ago, the intense mining seems to have wound down. The pollution record goes quiet, and why it stopped is a genuine unsolved question. It was not because the copper ran out, because there were still enormous quantities left in the ground, as the industrial miners of the 1800s would happily prove. The best guesses point to a shift in climate, or a change in what the culture valued, or a reorganisation of trade. But the honest answer is that we do not know why the boom ended when it did. This is exactly the kind of real, unresolved mystery that the fake history machine loves to hijack, and it is worth walking through how it does that, because it is the perfect rehearsal for the big lie we are about to face. You will find websites and videos that take these true facts, the ancient pits, the abandoned copper, the sudden stop, and then ask, with a knowing tone, so where did all the copper go? They claim that more than £1 billion of copper are missing, that the native miners could not possibly have used it all, and that therefore it must have been shipped across the Atlantic to feed the Bronze Age of Europe, mined by Minoans or some other Old World seafarers, part of a lost global empire that mainstream archaeology refuses to acknowledge. It is nonsense, and it falls apart the moment you press on it. That headline figure of £1 billion or more of missing copper is not a real measurement. It traces back to a single rough estimate made decades ago, in the 1960s, and the archaeologists who have examined it since point out that the true amount of copper mined in prehistory is simply unknown. The copper is not actually missing. It is exactly where you would expect it to be in the archaeological record of native North America, worked into tools and spear points and ornaments, and traded outward across the whole continent along those same routes we have been tracing all night. Lake Superior copper turns up in the Hopewell Mounds of Ohio, in the graves of Cahokia, in the great mortuary at Spiro. That is where it went. It flowed south and east into the hands of the mound builders over thousands of years through the greatest indigenous trade network on the continent. There are no Minoan shipwrecks at the bottom of Lake Superior, and no lost white mining empire. What there is, instead, is a Native American achievement so impressive that people would rather invent Atlanteans and ancient Europeans than give the credit to the folks who actually earned it. 14. The Mound Builder. Myth. And that impulse, that specific revealing impulse to look at something magnificent built by Native Americans and immediately go hunting for anyone else to credit, is not new, and it is not confined to the internet. It is, in fact, the oldest and most consequential lie in American archaeology. It has a name, and it is time at last to face it head-on. Historians call it the Mound Builder myth, and the greatest mystery of the American mounds, it turns out, was never who built them. The real mystery is why an entire country spent 100 years insisting that someone else had. Let me take you back to the beginning, to the man who got it right before almost anyone got it wrong. In the 1780s, on his own property in Virginia, Thomas Jefferson, the future president, did something no one in America had really done before. Instead of guessing or digging straight down to loot the thing for treasure, he cut a careful trench through the mound from the side so he could read the layers. He looked at how the bones in the soil were arranged in cross-section, the way you would read the pages of a book. And from that patient, methodical work that historians now credit as one of the first genuinely scientific archaeological excavations anywhere in the world, Jefferson reached a calm, evidence-based conclusion. The mound had been built in stages over long periods of time by the ancestors of the Native Americans who still lived in the region. The builders were simply the forebears of the people standing right there in the valley. He was correct, in the 1780s. And then, for more than 100 years, his own country chose to ignore him. Because as settlers poured across the Appalachian Mountains in the late 17 and early 1800s and spread into the Ohio Valley and the Mississippi Valley, they kept running into the earthworks, the mounds, the geometric enclosures, the great flat-topped pyramids of soil, and instead of asking the native people who lived there or reading their Jefferson, a different story took hold, and it spread like wildfire through newspapers, pamphlets, and wildly popular books. The story went like this. These magnificent works could not possibly be the product of the Native Americans that white settlers were busy dispossessing, people they had already decided were primitive, nomadic savages incapable of civilization. So the mounds must be the work of some other people, a vanished race, a lost civilization, more advanced, more noble, and crucially usually imagined as white, or at least as something other than Indian, and the candidates for this phantom lost race were a parade of the exotic. Some said the mound builders were a wandering tribe of ancient Israelites, the lost tribes of the Bible. Some said Phoenicians or Egyptians or the survivors of sunken Atlantis. Some said Vikings or the Welsh or refugees from Toltec Mexico. Books like Josiah Priest's American Antiquities, which sold in staggering numbers in the 1830s, packed these fantasies together and fed them to a hungry public. And a whole new American religion, founded in that same window of the 1820s and 30s, wove the lost race narrative directly into its scripture, telling of a vanished civilized people in the Americas destroyed in great wars by the ancestors of the Indians. The idea was everywhere. It was in the churches, in the bestsellers, in the newspapers, in the parlours. To sell it, people cheated. The era produced a rash of archaeological hoaxes, fake artifacts planted or forged to prove the mounds belonged to the Old World. There was an inscribed stone, supposedly pulled from a West Virginia mound, covered in mysterious foreign-looking characters. There was an elaborate fabricated chronicle of the Lenape people, presented as an ancient migration record that turned out to be a modern forgery. There were engraved tablets, later exposed as frauds, meant to prove that literate Europeans or Israelites had lived in ancient Iowa. Each fake was designed to do the same job, to pry the mounds out of native hands and place them in someone else's. Which raises the question that gets to the bottom of the whole thing. Why? Why did I lie this elaborate catch on so completely when the truth was sitting right there? Jefferson had already published the correct answer. The descendants of the builders were living in plain sight and could have been asked at any time. The answer is the hard, cold heart of this entire story, and it is the reason I have called this a lie rather than a mistake. The myth caught on because it was useful, profoundly, politically useful. In exactly those decades, the United States was taking the continent. It was pushing native nations off their homelands, by treaty and by broken treaty, by pressure and finally by force, in the great catastrophe of Indian removal, the Trail of Tears and everything like it. And a nation that thinks of itself as good, as righteous, needs a story that lets it do a terrible thing while still feeling righteous. The mound builder myth was that story. Because if you believed that a noble, civilized, advanced race had once built these wonders, and that the ancestors of today's Indians had swept in and slaughtered them and destroyed their civilization, then everything changed. The Indians were no longer the original inhabitants of a homeland being stolen from them. They became, in this fantasy, the original invaders, the destroyers of a prior civilization. And that meant taking their land was not a theft at all. It was justice, a reclamation. You were not stealing from the first Americans. You were avenging them. That is why the lie was told. It laundered a theft into a moral crusade. And it was not whispered in the margins. It was spoken from the heights of power. When President Andrew Jackson pushed his Indian removal policy through Congress around 1830, he leaned on exactly this idea, gesturing at the memorials of a vanished superior people to soften the expulsion of the living. Other presidents of the century echoed versions of it. The myth became part of the intellectual case for manifest destiny, the belief that the United States was divinely ordained to take the whole continent. The mounds, the actual achievements of actual Native Americans, were turned into a weapon against their own descendants. 15. The Smithsonian twist. And that is where the Smithsonian comes in. And here is the twist I have been promising you since the very first minute. Because if you spend any time at all in the modern world of Internet Ancient Mysteries content, you have heard a very specific claim, that the Smithsonian Institution, the great National Museum, is engaged in a vast cover-up. That its agents have spent over a century seizing and hiding and destroying evidence, especially the skeletons of a race of giants found in the mounds, in order to suppress the truth about who really built ancient America. It is one of the most popular conspiracy theories in the whole genre. Giant skeletons pulled from the mounds, spirited away by the Smithsonian, never to be seen again. It is false, all of it. The giant skeletons were newspaper hoaxes and tall tales from the 1800s, an era when papers printed sensational nonsense to sell copies. The same era that gave us the Lost Race fantasy in the first place. There is no vault of hidden giants, no secret cover-up. But I want to show you just how backwards this particular conspiracy is, because it is almost poetic. In the 1880s, the United States Congress, tired of the endless mound builder controversy, gave money to the Smithsonian's Bureau of Ethnology to settle the question once and for all with science. The head of the Bureau, John Wesley Powell, put a man named Cyrus Thomas in charge of a division of mound exploration. And when Cyrus Thomas began, he himself believed in the lost race. He assumed, going in, that the mounds had been built by some vanished separate people. He was not out to defend the Indians. He was out to find the facts. And then he and his team spent close to 2 decades doing the hard, unglamorous work. They surveyed and excavated thousands of mounds across the eastern United States. They mapped them, measured them, dug them, catalogued what was inside them. They gathered evidence on a scale no one ever had before, and the evidence changed Thomas's mind completely. In 1894, he published the results, a report running to more than 700 pages, and it did to the mound builder myth what a landslide does to a house of cards. Thomas demonstrated, mound after mound, region after region, that the earthworks showed clear, unbroken continuity with the cultures of known, living, historic Native American tribes, the Cherokee, the Shawnee, others, the building styles, the artifacts, the burial practices, the whole material record connected the ancient mounds to the recent and present inhabitants, exactly as Jefferson had said a century before. There was no lost race. There never had been one. The mounds were Native American from top to bottom, built over thousands of years by the ancestors of the people who are still right there. Thomas buried the myth under a mountain of facts so heavy that in serious scholarship it never got up again. The irony is almost too perfect to bear. The Smithsonian, the exact institution that today's conspiracy theories accuse of hiding the truth about who built the mounds, is the very institution whose landmark report proved, definitively, that the builders were Native Americans. The Smithsonian did not suppress the answer. The Smithsonian is where the answer came from. The cover-up story is more than wrong. It is precisely, exactly 180 degrees backwards. The people shouting that the museums are hiding the real mound builders are, without knowing it, still doing the work of the original lie. They are still trying to take the mounds away from the Native Americans who built them, still hunting for giants and lost races and anyone at all to credit except the obvious, evidenced, living answer. The giant skeleton videos are the mound builder myth wearing a Halloween costume. Same lie, new paint. Still doing the same job it was invented to do in Andrew Jackson's America, which is to erase the real people who raised these wonders out of the earth. And in case there was ever any lingering doubt, the 20th and 21st centuries closed the case with tools Cyrus Thomas never dreamed of. Radiocarbon dating now lets us date the mounds directly, and it shows a continuous tradition of indigenous construction stretching from more than 3,000 years before Christ, at Watson Break, all the way up to and past the year 1500, matching perfectly the known span of native occupation. DNA links ancient remains to living tribes, as it did with the Picuras Pueblo and Chaco. The oral histories of dozens of nations connect them to these places, and the descendants themselves, the Osage, the Caddo, the Hopi, the Zuni, the O'odham, the peoples of the Mississippi and the Ohio and the deserts, say the same thing their ancestors would have said to Henry Brackenridge in 1811, if only he had asked instead of assumed. We built these. We are still here. 16. The mysteries that remain. So the fake mystery is dead. Good. Let it stay dead. But everything is not solved. Far from it. Strip away the lie, restore the real builders, and the genuine mysteries do not shrink. They stand up taller. They just stop being about who and start being about why. And the why questions are the ones that will still be haunting archaeologists long after every one of us is gone. There is a pattern in what we walk through tonight, and nobody planned it. Cahokia empties out around 1350. Chaco Canyon is abandoned in the 1200s. Mesa Verde, silent by 1300. Spiro, gone by 1450. The Hohokam canals fall quiet around 1450. Across the whole of the continent, north and south, east and west, in the 2 or 3 centuries, right before Europeans arrived, the great centres came undone, the cities emptied, the ceremonial capitals faded, and the great canal empires simply dissolved. It happened in the wet river valleys and out in both deserts, high and low. It reached the farmers and the engineers, the mound builders and the cliff dwellers, and we cannot fully say why. That is a real mystery, and it is a big one, arguably one of the largest open questions in all of American archaeology. Something was moving through this continent in those years, something that made the old, dense, centralized ways of living stop working. We have pieces of it. There was a great climate shift, the fading of the warm, stable centuries that had let these societies balloon, and the arrival of harsher, drier weather, the droughts that starved the corn from New Mexico to Colorado, the return of the megafloods to the Mississippi after 500 quiet years. There were the internal strains that any large, unequal, centralized society carries inside it, the political fractures, the loss of faith in the leaders and the religions that had held everything together. Probably it was different combinations of these things in different places, all landing in the same rough span of time. But that is a description, not an explanation. Nobody has closed the case on why the golden age of ancient North America came apart when it did, and how much was the sky, and how much was the people themselves, and that continental puzzle is only the biggest of them. The smaller ones are just as stubborn. We still cannot firmly date the Great Serpent Mound, cannot say for certain whether that quarter-mile snake was laid down 2,300 years ago or 900, or whether both are somehow true. Nobody can tell you why free mobile hunter-gatherers at Watson Break and Poverty Point poured lifetimes of labour into mounds they did not live on, and did not bury their dead in. What those places meant, what the gatherings were reaching for. The great copper boom of Lake Superior wound down 3,000 years ago, while the metal was still far from gone, and no one knows why. We have no firm answer for who exactly scraped the giants into the desert at Blythe, or precisely when, or why they made sacred figures that only the sky can read. and how much astronomical knowledge, how many more lunar observatories of Earth, were ploughed under the cornfields of Ohio and Indiana before anyone thought to ask what the shapes meant, we will never be able to count. And underneath every one of those there is the deepest silence of all. We can measure these places to the inch. We can date the charcoal, map the alignments, sequence the DNA, weigh the copper, count the beads. What we cannot do is read the minds of the people who made them. Not one of these cultures left us a written language we can crack open and read. So the equinox sun rises out of the shoulder of Monks Mound exactly as they intended, and we do not know the name of the god it honoured. The octagon at Newark catches the moon at the far end of its 18-year swing, and we do not know the words they said when it happened. The serpent swallows the sun on the longest day of the year, and we do not know the story. We have the grammar of these places exact and undeniable. We have lost the meaning, and that gap between how much we can prove and how little we can understand is a stranger and more honest mystery than any invented tale of giants ever was. 17. Back to the foot of the mound. None of it needs a lost race or a cover-up or Atlantis or ancient astronauts or a hidden white empire. The truth was always enough. It was always more than enough. Which brings us back at the very end to where we started, to a single hill of earth on the Mississippi floodplain, and to the man standing at the foot of it, asking the wrong question. Go back to the summer of 1811. Put yourself where Henry Brackenridge stood at the foot of Monks Mound, looking up at 10 stories of shaped and terraced earth, a structure broader at its base than the Great Pyramid of Giza, one of well over 100 mounds spread across a city site that had once held 20,000 souls. Only now, look at it with the myth stripped away and the real people put back. This was a city. A planned, walled, thriving city, with neighbourhoods and plazas and a downtown, with a calendar of cedar posts to catch the rising sun, with priests and rulers and a trade network that pulled shells from the Gulf, and copper from Lake Superior, and stone from the Rockies into one place on the Mississippi. It was larger than the London of its day. It was one of the great human achievements of its entire age, anywhere on the planet, and it was built, every basket of it, by the ancestors of Native Americans. The people who did it were not Atlanteans or Israelites or wandering Welshmen, and they did not vanish. Their descendants are alive tonight, this very evening, and they never for one moment stopped being here. Brackenridge stood there and asked who could have built this, and that question, the one that felt so natural to him, the one that launched 100 years of lies, was the wrong question from the start. It only ever came from the refusal to believe an answer that was staring him in the face. The who was never a mystery. The who was standing beside him in the valley. But there is a right question. A real one. A haunting one. And the people of Cahokia left it behind for us, unanswered, on purpose or not, when they walked away. It is not who built the greatest city in ancient North America. It is why they left it. Why, after only 3 centuries, after all that labour and all that glory, did they set it down and go? Was it the river, waking up after 500 years of calm and remembering how to flood, drowning the fields the city depended on? Maybe the drought that came for the corn. Maybe the slow poison of too many people in one place, the political fractures, the loss of faith in whatever the Great Mound had meant. Most likely all of it at once, stacking up season after season until, one family at a time, they made the oldest human decision there is and walked towards somewhere better. We do not know, genuinely, honestly, after more than a century of careful work, we do not know, and that not knowing does not need a single giant or a single lost race to be one of the most haunting mysteries on the continent. A city the size of medieval London, raised in a lifetime, abandoned by choice, its reasons carried off in the memories and the grief of the people who left it, memories that were never written down and are gone. That is the real story of ancient North America, not the fairy tale. The real one is better. It is stranger and sadder, and it has the enormous advantage of being true. The wonders are real. All of them. Native American, everyone, and most of them still here, under the parking lots and the interstates and the cornfields of the American Midwest and Southwest. One of the great lost urban landscapes of the ancient world, and we have barely begun to read it. Thousands of mounds still stand out there in the grass, and thousands more were ploughed flat before anyone thought to ask what they were. The people who raised them were told, by an entire nation, for an entire century, that they did not exist. And maybe that is the deepest mystery of all, the one that has nothing to do with archaeology, not how a vanished race built these places, because no vanished race did. But how a whole nation could stand in front of the truth of a living people and their ancestors' genius, plainly visible, thoroughly documented, confirmed by its own scientists, and choose, for 100 years, to believe a more convenient lie instead. That is not a mystery about ancient America. That is a mystery about us. About how easily any of us will trade a true story we do not like for a false one that lets us sleep. The Mounds are still asking that question. They have been asking it, patiently, for 200 years. And it is worth deciding for yourself tonight whether we have finally started to give them an honest answer. So the next time you drive past a low green rise on the edge of a town, somewhere in Ohio or Illinois or Wisconsin or Alabama, and it strikes you that the hill is a little too even, a little too deliberate to be the work of wind and rain, slow the car down and really look at it. It might be nothing, a natural swell of earth, no more. Or it might be 1,000 years old. It might be the last surviving trace of a city, raised one loaded basket at a time by people whose descendants are still here, and still waiting for the rest of us to notice what is sitting right there beside the highway. I keep coming back to one thing, and I want to know where you land on it. The fake mysteries, the giants, the lost white race, the great museum cover-up, they rob the true story of everything that makes it extraordinary. The real questions are still out there, and they are not small. Why they walked away from Cahokia? What emptied the southwest and the southeast in the same few dark centuries? Who those giant figures in the desert were really meant for? I have laid out the evidence as honestly as I know how, from both sides, and now it goes where it always should. To you. Pick the one that would not let you go, and tell me in the comments which mystery you would give anything to solve. I read them. And on this channel the theories down there are half the reason to come back. If tonight opened something in you, if you find you cannot quite stop thinking about the scale of what was built and lost on this continent, then I have 2 more for you, and each one goes deeper into a different corner of the strangeness. The first is the story of the largest ancient copper operation the world has ever found, up on the shores of Lake Superior, where somebody pulled staggering amounts of pure metal out of the earth thousands of years ago, and then simply stopped. It is called the largest ancient copper mine in history makes no sense, and it picks up the thread we only touched tonight. And the second reaches back further still, to the very end of the last ice age, to the moment roughly 12,800 years ago when something struck this planet hard enough to reset the story of the human race. That one is called 12,800 years ago something stopped the world. Watch either one next. I have a feeling you already know which. And one last thing, before I let you go. We have not found them all, not even close. Every year archaeologists flying lasers over the treetops, mapping the bare shape of the ground beneath the forests, turn up earthworks nobody knew were there, whole complexes of mounds and walls and plazas that had been hiding in plain sight under 200 years of woods and farmland. The map of ancient North America is still being drawn. Some of the greatest discoveries on this continent have almost certainly not been made yet, and they are waiting out there right now under a ridge somewhere, under a field somebody mows every Saturday, for the person patient enough to look. So keep your mind open, and keep your curiosity sharper than your certainty. And until the next mystery pulls us back together, from all of us here at Anunnaki Dreams, thank you for listening, take good care of yourself out there, and good night.